Ode Tempest got a massive rework in Preludes 12. This used to be Soulframe's most powerful pact by a large margin, and now it's the least powerful by an equally large margin. There is one thing the new Ode Tempest does that is very fun to play with, but I don't think that's how any of this should work. So let's talk about it. By the time you see this, DE will be back from their holiday break, which means hotfixes will start rolling in again. Ode Tempest definitely needs some of that attention. I tried so hard to make a solo Cogah viable build, and it just didn't work. You can still use Ode Tempest and Cogah if your weapon skills can hard carry you through fighting or Gari, but at that point it's not really a pact build anymore. Both my Orangal and my Garen Rude builds are playable with other weapons and runes, and the pact will meaningfully contribute to boss fights. That just doesn't feel true with Ode Tempest. I did, however, discover something that wasn't in the patch notes, and it's had a huge impact on my opinion of Soulframe's fundamental combat mechanics. So we're still going to look at how Ode Tempest works, but then instead of doing a build guide, let's use Ode Tempest to frame a conversation about Soulframe gameplay and what changes I hope we'll see in the near future. Let's start with what Ode Tempest Arcanics currently do. Sizemore rolls out a ball that deals more damage the farther it rolls. Probably. It's hard to be sure because of how badly DE nerfed the spirit scaling. This used to roll up mountains and did great damage on a spirit build. Now in P12, here is Cammy standing on the spot where Sizemore explodes when I've got 2 spirit, and here's how much farther it went when I had 39 spirit. That is not a difference that will be meaningful in combat. Sizemore's explosion damage also seems to have been nerfed, although I'm not sure if the scaling is actually different here or if increased enemy armor just makes it feel nerfed. Either way, it just isn't very useful as a DPS ability in endgame combat. It does still shove enemies away, but Ode Tempest's kit is now more than ever focused on close-range melee combat, so the only time you'd want to shove an enemy away is to get some breathing room during a boss fight. And all bosses and mini-bosses are now immune to its knockback. So yeah, it's just not very good. Astrosphere and Atmosphere are a bit more complicated. The in-game description for these abilities is outdated, and the description in the patch notes is a bit misleading since it claims voltaics weaken a foe's stability, but Ode Tempest Arcanics neither affect nor are affected by voltaic damage. I tested them with Hurlwind, Archstorm, and Odiac, our only sources of voltaic damage in Preludes 12. None of these had any special effects with either Astrosphere, Atmosphere, or the synergy between them. I think this is just meant to be flavor text for describing Ode Tempest's Arcanics. It would be great if these abilities did synergize with voltaic damage, because that would make Ode Tempest's unique pact upgrades a lot more useful. Lightning Strike gives you extra voltaic damage against downed enemies, and Gravitate lets you grapple to a target using your kick input and then deal extra voltaic damage with your next melee attack. This is fun to use for mobility in melee combat, but even maxed out the damage is so low it often can't penetrate enemy armor. Lightning Strike does a bit better damage-wise, but you're going to stagger break enemies more often than you knock them down, so its utility is still pretty limited. Anyway, back to Astrosphere. What Astrosphere actually does is deal some stagger that scales with courage, and then it applies a debuff to all enemies in its range. This range does scale with grace, but not meaningfully. The sphere itself has a fixed duration that does not scale, but the debuff does have a duration that scales very weakly with spirit, roughly 0.3 of a second per point in spirit. If this scaling were stronger, we might be able to make a case for an Ode Tempest spirit build because Astra's debuff causes enemies to take much more stagger from all sources. But, of course, the amount of extra stagger they take scales with courage, and this is both actually noticeable and much more meaningful than the spirit scaling. Finally, we have Atmosphere. According to the P12 patch notes, Atmosphere now buffs your armor instead of making you immune to damage, although how this practically plays out is worth discussing. I noticed that the first few hits from normal mobs seemed to do no damage unless they were heavy attacks. I also noticed that even fully mitigated attacks resulted in the red border around my screen that we typically see when we take damage, even though my health bar didn't appear to move. So, what I think is happening here is that Atmosphere buffs your armor by a massive amount, but unlike Song of Growth, this is not a set amount that stays for the duration of the buff. Instead, I think it's an armor pool that gets reduced with each incoming attack, kind of like a second stability bar. Attacks that would be fully mitigated by Atmosphere still do 1 damage, just like when you're trying to hit an enemy with a gray nameplate. Heavy attacks bypass at least some of that mitigation, just like heavy attacks bypass blocks. When the armor pool is fully depleted, the sphere drops, and Atmos ends. This is just a theory, so I could be wrong here, but even if I am, what's certain is that Atmosphere no longer protects you for a fixed number of hits that scales with your spirit. Instead, your spirit determines the maximum amount of time Atmosphere can be active, and incoming attacks reduce that duration in some way that is proportional to the strength of the attack. Unfortunately, this means Atmosphere drops extremely quickly in endgame combat. Nimrod drops the sphere with one attack, even outside of Cogah. And this is the first place Ode Tempest can really teach us a few things about where Soulframe needs a bit of work. Armor does very little for the Envoy and way too much for enemies. I don't want to harp on this too much because armor changes are coming with the virtue changes, so hopefully this is not going to be an issue for very long. That said, as DE works on the new system, I hope they are paying attention to how armor affects the utility of sidearms. Right now, in most boss fights, sidearms are only useful for proccing smite or stripping armor because they don't do enough damage to bypass enemy armor without that strip, or sometimes even with it. This seems like a terrible waste, since many of our sidearms are really cool weapons that are lots of fun to play, so I hope the new virtue system brings some pretty fundamental changes to armor mechanics. But back to Atmosphere. Aside from the armor buff, this arcanic will also cause enemies to take a significant amount of stagger when they attack you, which has a chance to proc smite when it activates. If Atmosphere stayed up longer, this would be so good, but the effectively short duration is really limiting here. Atmos and Astra still do have synergy when you cast them together, but now it just causes Atmos to proc stagger as an AoE instead of to a single target. Usually. I think? The patch note said they fixed Atmos and Astra not synergizing correctly, but I think there must still be some bugs here because sometimes Atmos and Astra synergize for a great burst of damage, and sometimes they just proc AoE stagger. I'm really not sure what's supposed to be happening here, but what we've actually got in game is pretty underwhelming. Yes, you can use Ode Tempest to dish out a ton of stagger, effectively CCing an entire battlefield, but to do that you have to use two arcanics with extremely long cooldowns and pair them with a weapon that deals meaningful stagger. There are several ways to accomplish this, like using Arrow Hail and Splinter and the Totem and Combat Arts that increase stagger on splintered arrows, or using Marrow's Bane with Misscale for both the extra stagger from the projectile and the double utility slots for the totems that give you CDR and Spirit and Grace abilities. Or you could CC just as many enemies with Behest or Pictrix Powder and still have other arcanics worth using and much shorter cooldowns on everything. Or you could use Bestone and CC fewer enemies but actually do some damage to them. My point is that while Ode Tempest can be okay for AoE CC, you'll have to fully build around making it work, and you'll still be effectively without a pact while you wait for your cooldowns. And as much as I would like to make an argument for this being a beginner-friendly pact, since it is much better against low-level enemies in normal mode when you don't have to worry about Cogah's excessive cooldown increase, no beginner has this pact. Ode Tempest now requires 80,000 standing just to be able to purchase it, and then costs another 27,500 standing to buy. By the time you get there, you want something stronger. So, is there any reason to use Ode Tempest in Preludes 12? Actually, yes. Atmosphere has one other function that isn't mentioned anywhere in the patch notes or the ability description, and it is so good. It's like a breath of fresh air. It makes me want to build for smite procs and grace cooldown and have Atmos up as much as possible. Atmosphere makes you immune to stagger. You don't take the stability damage that fills your stability bar, you don't get interrupted by enemy attacks, you don't get knocked around by Odin grenades, you just actually get to play the game and it feels so good. For some reason this attack can still knock you prone, so I'm guessing some of the waist bear combat mechanics might do so too, but even despite that this feels so much better. I had not realized how incredibly excessive stagger had gotten until I started testing Atmosphere. I knew it was an issue, it's kind of impossible not to notice, but I think I'd forgotten how much fun Soulframe combat can be when you aren't getting knocked around like a pinball. Yes, target lock still has some issues, but Steve already said they're working on that, and it's gotten better over time so we can already see progress. But stagger has gone in the other direction. It's worse now than it's ever been. If I could choose just one thing to change for Soulframe in 2026, this would be it. Let me take a hit without getting interrupted. Let me miss a parry and not get fully killed because I'm chain stun-locked by all the overlapping mechanics that cause me to lose control of my character. Let me take the damage but keep playing the game. I've heard people argue that Soulframe's melee combat is underpowered compared to its ranged combat, but I don't think that has to be true. Riposte, Spectre Strike, and Health Regain are all mechanics that only work if you're in melee range, and they are all really fun and satisfying to use, so they should make melee combat just as strong as ranged combat. The problem is how easily all of those mechanics can be interrupted. Being able to regain my health doesn't help if I'm staggered out of the attack. Being able to counterattack after a perfectly timed block or dodge doesn't help if I can get staggered out of the counterattack. Soulframe already has incredibly good melee combat mechanics ready for us. We just need to be able to use them. I do have a personal bias here. I am a prime sure-footed enjoyer in Warframe, and I am not ashamed to admit it. I just don't enjoy stagger mechanics and very much appreciate the fact that Warframe gives me a way to counter them. If Soulframe had an equivalent totem, I would instantly put that in the defense slot of every weapon. But I think there are many ways DE could solve Soulframe's stagger problem. For starters, stability should actually make us stable. I don't really understand what the constant interrupts are supposed to add to the game, but if I at least had some way to counter them or build against them, I probably wouldn't mind as much. I still think combat would just feel more fun overall with fewer interrupts and stagger locks, but maybe that's just me. So you, Envoy, try this out. Put on Ode Tempest, cast Atmosphere, and see how combat feels without all that stagger. Never mind target lock for now, but how much does stagger immunity impact your enjoyment of Soulframe combat? How much stagger do you think the game needs, and how would you like to be able to respond to it as the player? Personally, I'm going back to using Ode Tempest to level up melee weapons because for me it just makes the melee combat so much more enjoyable, even if it means my Arcanics are relatively underpowered. But I'm just one Envoy and this game should be fun for all of us, so let me know in the comments what you think. In the meanwhile, I've got 5 more P12 pact builds to make, so subscribe if you want to see whether or not we can get through all of them before P13. Thank you so much for watching, and until next time, happy hunting! We're gonna try and do some Spectre Strikes while we wait. Oh, I had the Spectre Strike and you staggered me! How can you stagger me? I hate your stupid stagger! I hate stagger! Ah!